The wind rolled across the open plains with a long, low hum that carried the dust of 100 forgotten seasons, sweeping over the weather-beaten fences of Elijah McGraw's ranch as though the land itself were whispering memories into the morning air. And Elijah, broad-shouldered, graying at the temples, his hands calloused from decades of wrangling cattle and burying hardships, stood on the porch of his lonely homestead, watching the sky bleed from starlit indigo into the first pale orange of dawn. He was a man who had learned to read the land the way some men read scripture, who understood every crack in the earth and every shadow in the timberline, and yet on that morning, something felt different, a weight in the air like the quiet moment before a storm decides whether or not to break, and he could not shake the sense that the day would not unfold like any other, especially not with the memory of the night before still etched into his mind. The moment he had handed over the deed, his deed, to a young Apache man named Keone and his weary family, their faces drawn from too many miles of running, their eyes shining with the stunned disbelief of people who had never expected generosity from a man of his skin, his uniform, or his history, and Elijah remembered Keone's daughter clutching a worn blanket to her chest, her dark eyes cautious but curious, and the way Keone had bowed his head with such solemn gratitude that Elijah's own throat had tightened, because what he had done had not been born from pity or heroism but from a debt he had carried for decades, a debt carved into his heart by an Apache boy who once saved his life in a canyon far from here. Before the wars, before the bitterness, before the world turned good men into enemies, the night had been long after Keone's family settled into the old bunkhouse near the eastern ridge, and Elijah had lain awake wondering whether his decision would be embraced or condemned by the neighbors who believed the land belonged only to those who had plowed it, fenced it, and died defending it, but he reminded himself that fences were human things, not the earth's idea, and the land had never belonged to him in the first place, not really, not in any way that mattered to the spirits who had roamed here long before he was born, and as he stepped down onto the dry soil with a sigh, he glanced toward the ridge where thin lines of chimney smoke already rose from the bunkhouse, meaning Keone's family was awake, settling, hopeful, or so he prayed, but then a motion caught his eye, something shifting near the far horizon, a dark ripple of movement like the stirring of a herd, and his breath snagged as the shapes grew clearer. Riders, dozens of them, maybe more, their silhouettes crowned by the rising sun, riding in absolute silence, the steady drumming of hooves growing louder with every heartbeat, and for a moment Elijah's hand drifted toward the revolver on his hip out of old habit, though he knew immediately, before the riders even crested the final dip, that these were not hostile men, not raiders, and not strangers. These were Apache, an entire tribe, proud in posture and disciplined in formation, moving like a single living organism across the land that had been theirs long before the maps changed and the borders shifted, and Elijah felt his pulse throb through him, like a drumbeat of destiny, because somehow he understood they were not passing through, they were coming to him, to the gift he had given, and to the man who had given it. The hooves thundered up the slope until the first row of riders came into full view, stern men with braids whipping behind them, women riding with effortless authority, elders wrapped in woven blankets that carried symbols older than any ranch in these plains, and at the front rode a tall, commanding figure with a fierce hawk-like gaze, a man whose presence seemed to carry the gravity of mountains, and Elijah realized with a jolt that this must be the tribal chief himself, the leader of Keone's people, and suddenly the old rancher felt the weight of his gesture in a way he hadn't last night, for giving one man land was one thing, but giving land that belonged to a tribe's ancestral memory was something far deeper, something that might ignite gratitude, or controversy, and Elijah straightened his back as the riders halted before him in a perfect, thunderless stop, dust swirling around them like restless spirits, and the chief dismounted with slow, deliberate steps, his expression unreadable, neither hostile nor warm, only ancient in its steadiness, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the solemn authority of a man who had seen too many promises broken and was wary of believing a new one, yet something flickered in his eyes when he looked at Elijah, a recognition or perhaps disbelief, and Elijah found himself standing in the silent crosswinds of centuries-old tension, knowing that everything, his past, Keone's future, the tribe's judgment, would be decided in the next few breaths. The morning light spilled like molten gold across the valley as the tribe gathered around Elijah McGraw's ranch, their presence transforming the quiet homestead into a living tapestry of movement, color, and murmured anticipation, and though the air was calm, a strange tension shimmered beneath its surface, the kind that occurs when destinies long separated finally collide. Elijah stood before Chief Maka, broad-shouldered, stone-faced, carrying the weight of centuries in the lines of his weathered brow, and for a moment the world around them felt suspended, as if the land itself were holding its breath to witness what would unfold, for rare was the day an aging white rancher handed sacred ground back to those from whom it had been taken, And rarer still was the day an entire Apache tribe arrived at dawn to confront the truth of such a gesture. Keone stood slightly behind the chief, his posture rigid, torn between gratitude toward the man who had saved his family the night before and loyalty to his people, who watched everything with silent, unblinking intensity, and Elijah could not help noticing the uncertainty flickering in the younger man's dark eyes, because Keone had accepted the deed with humble reverence, but accepting land from a lone rancher was very different from standing before the tribe's leader while the entire nation of his ancestors looked on, and Elijah felt a pang of doubt press against his ribs as he wondered if he had made the boy's burdens heavier by trying to lighten them. The chief finally spoke in a tone like deep earth shifting under thunderclouds, his words measured but powerful as he questioned why a man whose people had pushed the Apache from these plains would suddenly give land to one of their families, and Elijah's throat tightened as he prepared to answer, not because he feared the tribe, but because the truth was raw, personal, and tied to a wound he had carried for years. Yet before he could speak, an elder stepped forward, her silver braids shimmering like streams of moonlight, her painted face solemn as she announced that the tribe's spiritual council had felt a stirring in the winds the moment Keone's family crossed the ridge the night before, a sign that events long foretold had begun to awaken. Elijah blinked, taken aback, unsure whether to trust or dismiss the mysticism, but the way the tribe listened, every warrior, every child, every elder leaning closer, told him that to them, these were not poetic notions but truths as solid as the mountains themselves. And when the chief turned back to Elijah, demanding the real reason for such an unprecedented act, the old rancher inhaled deeply, his chest rising with the weight of old grief, and he began to speak of a canyon far from these plains, of a younger version of himself bleeding beneath a burning sky after a cavalry skirmish gone wrong, and of an Apache boy, no older than 12, who had found him, treated his wounds, and guided him to safety at great risk to his own life. Elijah's voice wavered as he explained how he had searched for decades to repay that boy, who disappeared into the shifting sands of war and time, and how giving this land to Keone's family was not an act of charity but an offering to the spirits of the past, a tribute to the child who saved him and to the truth that some debts are written not on paper but on the soul. The tribe murmured in surprise, their eyes narrowing, studying Elijah with renewed interest, and Chief Maka's stern expression softened only for a heartbeat before settling back into its granite severity as he stepped closer, close enough that Elijah could smell the smoke on his clothes and see the deep scar running diagonally across his jaw. A scar old, healed, yet tied to battles Elijah could not imagine, and the chief told him that gratitude, while respected, did not erase the river of blood that had flowed between their peoples, nor did it bridge the chasm of betrayals carved across generations. But then the chief asked something unexpected, the name of the boy who had saved Elijah, and Elijah's heart stilled because he had never known it. The boy had refused to give his name, saying only that one day the wind would carry the truth to where it belonged, and Maka exchanged glances with the elders in a silence so tense it felt like a string pulled taut between worlds, and slowly, deliberately, he told Elijah a story. Decades ago, a young Apache boy had vanished from the tribe for 3 days during the height of the wars, returning with strange injuries and a distant look in his eyes, claiming he had helped a wounded white soldier whom the spirits insisted should not die, a claim so unbelievable at the time that few believed him. Yet the boy repeated only that, the land had spoken, and when Elijah heard this, a shiver rippled through him because he knew instantly, it had to be the same boy, and hearing that confirmation after years of uncertainty made his knees weaken. And then Maka revealed the final truth, that the boy had been his own son.